Okay, we are live.
Okay, I'm going to take a moment to share, okay?
Me too. Okay, everybody, we are here once more. Okay, we are here once more. Jeff and I. He's going to be interviewing me tonight. Hi, Dolores. Hi, Kay. Hello, Andrew Hiller. And hi, Barbara Wernick. How are you? Nice to see you all here. The two of us are taking a moment to share. Jeff Epstein has joined the stream on Facebook now.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Dolores and Kay and Andrew. Okay, I think I'm good.
Okay. So, if you could help us to share for a few minutes, people, that would be great. That would be wonderful. Okay, and Evelina, hello, how are you? Very nice to see you. Oh, gee, I'm afraid you're seeing my PhD thesis in the background here somewhere. That's so old now. It's getting to be almost as old as I
That would be impressive if it actually caught up to you.
Wouldn't that be weird? That's a weird thought, isn't it?
Yeah, I have not. Kay mentions the Michael Moore podcast with Stephanie Kelton. I've not heard it yet. I look forward to that.
Oh, I watched that today. That was excellent. It was done actually. I think it was yesterday. Okay, that it was done, or maybe even on the 21st. But it was a lengthy podcast.
You heard it? It was good?
Yeah, it was very good. Yeah, Michael Moore has just a wonderful voice for a podcast. You know, his manner is really wonderful, warm, kind. Okay, and
How familiar
Stephanie,
is he with MMT?
I don't think he's that familiar with MMT.
But he
So,
was, yeah.
so Stephanie was teaching him a lot.
Well, that's good.
Okay,
Good.
in other words, he knows that Stephanie, from his point of view, she is the authority. Okay, on MMT. So he wasn't there to express any skepticism. He was there to learn about MMT, and I think
That's good.
he learned a lot.
That's
Okay,
good. Glad
in
to hear
that
that.
particular session, and I think she taught him very very well. Of course, she's such a clear speaker. From the first time I saw her speak, I saw that she just has a very crystalline way, okay, of putting things.
Kay says, I love Michael Moore. I was a tech in for him too. What does that mean, Kay?
She says it was a tech in for him too.
Oh, teach in. Teach in. That's what she means.
Oh,
It was a teach in
it
for
was a
him too.
teach-in for him.
I got it.
Yeah, yeah.
I got it. I got it. Yeah, that's great. And actually, that's what really the Bernie, the coronavirus town hall and many of the things that he does, and Nina Turner actually did a teach-in on coronavirus a couple days ago, which that's great. I think that's
The
really
first
important.
event that I heard Stephanie speak at was called the Fiscal Sustainability Teach-In Counter Conference, and it took place on April 28th of 2010. And with a team of people, I organized it. It was my
Oh
idea to
wow.
have that particular conference, and
Wow, someone mentioned that as that was their first place of hearing about MMT. I don't recall who, but someone I recently interviewed said mentioned that that was the first thing that they heard. In fact, maybe it was Christian Riley.
yeah, it was the same day. Okay, we held it on the same day as the Peterson Foundation's first fiscal summit in 2010, because we wanted it, okay, to be an answer to the fiscal summit. And
Hmm.
but Bill Mitchell was there,
Oh wow.
and Stephanie, and Warren. Uh, the inflation section was done actually by Marshall Auerbach. He did a
Where was this
really
held?
excellent job. And the final panel was by Randy Ray and Pavlina. They shared that session. Okay, and then all of them participated in a discussion. Okay, on each of the presentations, and the Q&A was really animated. It was a wonderful conference. It was at George Washington. Okay, is where we held it,
George
here in
Washington
D.C.
University in DC.
In D.C. Yeah.
Andrew says that my volume is a little low. I don't know if you have the power to turn me up at all.
Uh, no, I don't have the power to turn you up, and you don't sound low to me, but I can turn up the volume on my mic,
Okay.
and let's see if that helps.
All right, I'll talk a little louder as well. So you want to officially get started here?
Yeah, I thought we had gotten officially started.
Well, we'll get officially started again.
Okay.
Okay, okay. So I'm gonna basically conduct this. I'm gonna be interviewing you for my podcast, and what I would like to do is I would like to talk about you, and then I have some basic concepts that I'd like to get into that I think you're going to be very helpful with. So good.
Okay.
Okay. So Joe, thank you very much for doing this.
Sure,
We're
Jeff.
recording Activist MMT, an episode of Activist MMT on your show, which is I was on your show in January of last year, before I had this podcast, and I turned that into an episode which was just released, which I think went really well when we talked about MMT comparing to monetary reform. So, if you would be willing to just introduce yourself, and could you please talk about your life before discovering MMT and work your way towards how you discovered it, please?
Okay. Well, I started out way back when I went to college. Okay, I went to Cornell. I was a government major, okay, in Cornell. So I got out of there with a BA, and my first exposure to formal economics, okay, to academic economics, was at Cornell, and I was taught by Keynesian, by somebody who was a liberal at that time. So he believed in deficit spending. This was before the Keynesians in the 1970s showed up. In the latter part of the 1950s, they were far more radical and socialistic, okay, than they became in the 1970s. And they believed, okay, in interventions by the government, and they believed in really big programs, okay, in big efforts. Okay, so I was educated, oops, I believe that we've lost Jeff, but he'll be back in a minute. So I'll continue to answer this question. Okay, Andrew says my volume is a bit low. Oh, Russ says sounds great here. I think Jeff is trying to get back in. I still don't see him. I don't know what went wrong with him. His devices are not yet connected, but here he is, and I'm adding him to the stream now. You're back.
Yep. Sorry about that. I don't know. My page crashed. I don't know what happened. So you were saying you were at Cornell. You were taught by a Keynesian who believed in deficit spending.
Yes, who believed in deficit spending and in large programs, okay, and the New Deal, okay, and all those nice things. And the Keynesians during the 1950s were actually rather radical. Okay, there were many of them who were somewhat socialist. Okay, in other words, they were sort of halfway between socialists and and some of the regular liberals. Uh,
Okay.
and so that's how I got my original training, okay, in government. Then I went into a PhD program, and it was one on international relations and also comparative politics. Okay, I went to Michigan State, and I studied their political instability, integration, conflict. Okay, so I was very oriented to mass movements, okay, and to political conflict. And I got my PhD studying attitudes in five cultures, okay, including Italy in the days when Italy was very politically unstable.
You said attitudes. You said attitudes?
Yes,
Attitudes about what? Maybe you're about to tell me?
towards politics.
Towards politics. Okay.
Towards politics. Okay, not opinions, okay, but attitudes. Okay, so this was a political cultural type, okay, of orientation, and it involved a lot of social psychology. So I became, through my PhD program, what they called then, okay, an interdisciplinary social scientist. When I got out of school, due to financial pressures of various kinds, okay, at that time, involving a divorce that I was going through, what I did was to join a research outfit, okay, in Buffalo that was owned by Cornell at the time, but later was kicked out of the university during the demonstrations and protests over the war, okay, in Vietnam, because the outfit, okay, that I was with was doing some defense research. Okay, now really, the research my group was doing was actually about conflict resolution research. In other words, it wasn't actually defense research in that sense. Okay, it had
But people
nothing.
were protesting you, and so your department got kicked out. Is that what you said?
Well, actually, the whole operation was kicked out. Okay, of Cornell, and became, okay, an unaffiliated organization. Essentially, a Beltway Bandit type of organization, but it was no longer. Okay, but it was not on the Beltway. It was located, okay, in Buffalo, New York.
Okay.
So I stayed with them for a few years, and I did some very interesting research. I learned a lot of things. I learned statistics there, and I learned how to do quantitative research, actually, generally, okay, and multivariate research. And I got very interested in that and got very heavy into it. And I continued working in the conflict area for some time. I left them in 1971 and I went to SUNY Binghamton and I was a professor there for a few years.
I was born in 1971. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So I was a professor there for a few years. But I did not go there on a hard money line. It was a strange situation. They hired me on a regular line, or they sent me such a letter offering me such a position. But they were a university funded by the state, and the state was having some fiscal problems at that time. And the state, between the time they sent me the offer letter and I accepted, okay, and the time I got a formal contract from them, they had a hiring freeze. And so they couldn't complete their contractual obligation to me. And I was young then, and wet behind the ears, didn't realize that I could probably hold them to it because the offer letter was tantamount to a contract offer, okay, in those days. And in my case, the state was guilty, breach of contract. Okay, but what they did instead, okay, without my having to say anything, they came up, okay, with another offer, which was that I could have 1/4 of a hard line. In other words, a line funded by hard money inside of the university, and 3/4, okay, of a research line. Okay, and at the time, I just was unaware what kind of difference that was going to make. Okay, because basically, the 1/4 line was a tenure track line, and the 3/4 was not.
Hmm.
And if they'd gone through with the original offer, then I would have been on a tenure track line. And I probably would have ended up at a university with tenure. Okay, I was actually an associate professor, okay, at that time. And I loved teaching, okay. And I loved also the university life, and I loved the research, okay, that I could do there. But after 4 years there, they ran out. After 4 years there, they ran out of the soft money, and I had only 1/4 of a line actually left.
Hmm.
So I went out there to find a job, and the only place somebody like me could really work at that time, somebody with strong research interests, formal research interests. I could go to New York and work in market research, but I didn't really have the stomach for that. I was into some very interesting and very heavy research in the value theory area, and it was heavy into to normative theory as opposed to descriptive theory. If you know what that means.
No, I
It's
don't.
about essentially justifying value judgments. Okay,
Okay.
so it's highly philosophical.
Hmm.
Okay, and I was into research of that kind, and I wanted to continue that research. So I decided to come to DC and try to get a research job in one of the think tanks there. And I caught on with one of those very quickly, and I was there for the rest of the 1970s. And I found that I could do much better financially as a consultant. So I became a consultant, okay, in the DC area, which was a very interesting experience. It was hard going for me because I was much more interested in the value theory than I was in fitting into the swing of things, okay, in the DC area. And so, after a few years doing that, and living by contracts alone, I decided I didn't really like that, and that what I really wanted to do, was to make a lot of money and come back in a few years, independently wealthy, and then do my value theory for the rest of my life. In other words, that was not very much of a plan, but it was a hope.
Okay.
Okay. And so, what I did then is microcomputers were just getting started.
Hmm.
And a friend of mine and I thought, boy, we can really have a really great business in the microcomputer area.
So now you're probably the early 1980s you're talking now.
I'm talking the late 1970s and the early 1980s. Yeah, we first started working together probably in 1979, okay, or 90 on that. We both had been doing contract work, and we had some work that was supporting us extremely well through first the Census Bureau, okay, and then the Department, okay, of Agriculture, the Farmers Home Administration, okay, the Department of Agriculture. Uh, it was work involving the analysis of census data and the correlates, okay, of census data and designing funding formulas, which were very popular at that time during the Carter administration. And that was about the equitable distribution of funds to states and cities, okay, and counties. Okay, and the distribution was supposed to be based in the Carter administration on the needs of states and counties, okay, and also cities, okay, local areas.
Okay.
So I worked on that for 4 years and did some really great research and a lot of great stuff on value theory also, and tying it into politics, okay, and into political applications. And then the Reagan administration happened,
Uh-oh.
okay, and I'll never forget because the guy who was sponsoring our research was a GS-15, okay, in the Department, okay, of Agriculture, and he was a Republican. And he was so happy when Reagan got elected. He thought that he would be golden. And don't worry, guys, it's going to be great for us. It's going to be great for this project because I'm a Republican. Within 6 months, the Republicans killed his project
Great.
and they kicked us out. So we decided then we were going to devote our full attention to microcomputer work.
Hmm.
And one thing led but to another, and I eventually became a microcomputer hardware systems integrator, something I never started out to do, but the market kind of drove me there.
So you
And
built computers.
I built computers for companies in the Washington area. Some of them were government outfits, and some of them were private sector outfits. We had a company that was highly technical capable, okay, at doing that, but had no capital, okay. And in those first years, we could actually force these companies to pay us upfront for the computers that we were able to deliver to them. Because, since we didn't have any capital, we weren't able to front them for the computers and be paid 60 days later or 90 days later. We couldn't afford to wait for that. So we would only do work, on a money upfront basis.
Wow.
You've never seen anything so funny as CIA people coming to a small business and counting out the dollars in currency to pay for their microcomputers because they liked our computers and that's the only way we would do business.
So you basically had a currency issuer come to you and say, "How much do you need?"
Well, and the CIA, of course, is not a currency issuer, but
Of
you know,
course, but they're one step removed from a currency issuer.
yeah, right, one step removed from the
You know,
currency
yeah.
issue.
Just a quick. You're reminding me of a very silly movie called The Core. You
Yeah,
ever seen that?
no,
And no, it's a stupid, fun, dumb action movie where the core of the Earth has stopped moving, and so they have to send the nuclear to dig a hole and send a nuclear bomb to get the core moving again.
oh, I
And
have
so
seen that.
the government goes, or some government people go to the people who are going to do this, and they say, "How much do you need to make this happen?" And he says, "You kidding me? I don't know, $20 billion." And then he says, "Will you take a check?"
Well, for some
Actually, maybe it might
reason,
even been trillion, but anyway, go ahead.
the CIA people, I guess, couldn't get a check up front, but they could get cash up front. That's probably why they were paying in cash. We did
Okay.
not actually require them to pay in cash. In other words, they could have paid up front with a check, and we would have accepted it. But for some reason, they just insisted on coming and paying in cash. So, all right, so
Nice.
that was
So
all
how long
right.
did that last for?
So we did very well for actually quite a few years, and we were growing, and we grew to maybe 20 people. I guess we must have installed 10 to 12,000 computers, okay, in the Washington area in that time.
Wow.
And then the Graham-Rudman-Hollings Act happened, and also 1988 happened, and the fiscal hawks got control, okay, of everything, and they put a freeze on the government, and our business dropped by 1/3, okay, in a
Mm.
single month.
Mm.
And I didn't move fast enough. You probably have gathered by now, I'm, pretty much a humanist guy, okay, and I care about, my people, and I cared about, our employees. So it really pained me when I had to when I cut off 6 members of our staff. It was really, really, really tough. I didn't cut enough. I needed to cut 10 people off that staff. And I didn't do it. I just didn't have.
Because you're a humanist, or because you were just miscalculated?
Well, it was very hard for me to cut people, so I erred on the wrong side. I cut
Mm.
too few.
No.
If I had cut maybe 10 people off, okay, or 11 people off, the business might have survived. Okay, but as it was, okay, it did not. We struggled for a few years later, but by 1991, I found myself on the street.
No.
Okay,
That was a good run.
uh, yeah, it was a pretty good run, but all our money was gone, and we were in quite a tight fix. And then I caught on with the market research company.
All right, before you get onto that, Lana actually has a question. Do you know Mike Paper, who lives in Montgomery County, Maryland, and worked for IBM?
No, Lana, I do not. I'm sorry, I don't know Mike Paper. So uh, I caught on with a company, okay, that was a database marketing company, actually.
Hold on a moment, Joe. Before you
Yeah.
get into this new chapter here, I just want to say I actually my earliest memory of computing was, I believe it was 1986 when the Challenger exploded. I believe that was 1986. And when the Challenger exploded, I was in seventh grade in my middle school library programming on a Trash 80, a TRS Tandy Radio Shack 80.
Yeah, TRS-80, I remember those.
And I remember specifically what I was programming too. And it was just basically all the programs on this 5-inch floppy disk. I was making a basically a trivial operating system of just drawing a picture, and then I didn't even finish it, but the goal was to just have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of all the programs on it. You would choose which one, and it would go start that program. And while I was doing this, they had an announcement. While I was in the library programming on the CRS-80, they had the announcement of please come to the cafeteria, which was the auditorium. And then we were watching videos for the rest of the, news for the rest of the day regarding the Challenger. So that's my earliest memory of computing. I actually, leading up to that was my earliest.
Okay,
I was a computer programmer. I worked as a computer programmer for 5 years. So
so I
go on to your
gather.
next chapter now.
Okay, so the next chapter of my life then was as an employee, a senior employee, for the database marketing company. They were interested in my statistical skills, and it turned out the multivariate work that I was doing during the 1970s, okay, and in my work for the Census Bureau, okay, in the latter part of the 1970s, okay, and the early part, okay, of the 1980s, was I thought I was dated because it was 10 years later, okay, but they thought I was very current.
Oh.
And from their point of view, I was the heavy guy in statistics in their company.
Hmm.
Okay, so it turned out to be very easy for me to catch on again and to earn a fairly high salary as a statistical analyst. So I worked for this company for a few years, and I learned things basically about databases, and also what was important in the database marketing business. And I actually got interested in that. It was intellectually interesting.
I During my programming career, I did some Oracle and some other related database work as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting stuff, actually.
It is, and even what do you call it? The programming on the database, like when something happens you input some data and it triggers depending on what that value is. It's very interesting stuff.
Right. Okay, but anyway, from there, the part that I got extremely interested in was data warehousing. The data warehousing business
Okay,
was closely related to the database marketing business,
sure.
because people started wanting to do database marketing and have a data warehouse to support them.
Hmm.
Okay, and in the second half of the 1990s, data warehousing, okay, was getting to be a big business. I became very interested in both data warehousing and also, okay, in object-oriented software, all software.
Okay, so first I'll just say a quick comment, which is I loved my favorite thing was object-oriented programming. That was my favorite thing. Favorite thing. But could you actually just briefly describe before you go on the difference between the database stuff and how that is different from the other term data warehousing?
Yeah, the database marketing work did not necessarily have to happen on a data warehouse. In the early days, okay, of database marketing, it was not being done on a data warehouse. Okay, it was being done on a mainframe system of some kind that did not involve any of the characteristics, okay, of data warehousing. Okay, but as the business went forward and data warehouses became available as a software created thing, the database marketers got very, very interested in the data warehousing area, and some of the people interested, okay, in database marketing got extremely interested in the data warehousing area. And so there was cross fertilization, between the two areas, and movement of people from one area to another. So I decided that I really liked, the data warehousing area, okay, and that what I was going to do was to move into that. And I decided that the area of the future in the data warehousing area was actually in object-oriented, but data warehousing.
Oh, wow.
So I wrote some papers on that subject. Okay,
Interesting. Okay.
and the
Hmm.
papers on that subject and my participation in online groups on that suddenly got a lot of people interested in my work in the data warehousing area, which was not really hands-on work. It was actually architectural work, okay, in data warehousing. And the more deeply I got into that, uh, I started asking some questions about it, and particularly when I used an object oriented approach to get at the data warehousing architecture, it looked to me like there was so much more involved in it than simply the data. So I began to encounter articles, and I began to ask myself, well, what is it that I'm really doing here? It became clear to me I wasn't actually doing data warehousing. All this time I was doing consulting for people on this work.
Hmm.
Okay. And I began to encounter articles as I was asking myself the question, what the hell is it that you're doing? Okay. And I started reading some articles and I realized there was a whole field for me. There was a discipline for me. And the name of it was actually knowledge management.
Oh, wow. Okay, so again, we're entering something new. I want to say something before we proceed, which is object. I forget object databases. Object. I don't remember the term that you used, but basically
Object
object
oriented databases.
object oriented
OO
databases.
databases, right?
Okay, object-oriented databases. So are you saying, does that mean that instead of each cell in a database holding a single atomic piece of information, that it can hold an object? So that
Yes.
object, okay, so let me, I'm gonna elaborate a little bit on this since I understand so that object can be, for example, a house, and in that house can be how many rooms it has, the square feet, it can have a lot of different characteristics, and each of those things can have, square feet could be 1100, so it can have any number of characteristics on it. Can it also have functionality? So it can actually have
Yes.
programming within that object as well.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, very interesting.
Yes. That
Yep,
was
and
it was a fascinating, fascinating area. Okay.
yeah.
But then when I got into knowledge management, in other words, when this actually led me into knowledge management, okay, I found a whole field which allowed me to go back to philosophy again. And my love of that, it got me into work in the theory of knowledge again. At one time, I was very heavy into epistemology. Okay, at the time, I was doing the value theory. Okay, in the 1970s,
Hmm.
very heavy into epistemology. And of course, one of the major problems, okay, in knowledge management is, what the hell is it that we're managing? What the hell is knowledge?
Wow,
And
that's
so
pretty
I began to
philosophical.
write, okay, a lot of papers about that. That grew, okay, into books, and I published three books, I guess, okay, in the knowledge management area. One was actually a monograph, okay, a short book, but two very substantial books.
So let me define, because I didn't know this. Epistemology means the
But
investigation of what distinguishes between belief and opinion.
oh, that's a part of it, okay. But epistemology is actually more broadly known as the theory of knowledge.
The theory of knowledge.
Okay, the theory of
Okay.
knowledge. And epistemology goes all the way back to the Greek philosophers. Okay, and in fact, there are still people today who believe that we ought to define knowledge in the way Plato defined it. And they're still defining knowledge in that way, as the basic definition of that. Okay, but I would never accept that. Okay, and I went into to other views. Okay, of knowledge.
How did
Uh,
Plato define it?
he defined it as justified by true belief.
Okay.
Okay,
Okay.
which gave me a problem. Okay, because of course, if you have a theory of truth similar to Plato's, okay, a correspondence theory, okay, of truth, uh, then okay, if you say that something is true, if and only if okay, it corresponds to the facts, okay, to what okay is out there, you run into philosophical problems. Okay, in other words, what you do is you run into the paradoxes. Okay, and if you believe that we cannot know the truth for sure, then you cannot know that a particular belief okay, that you have is true. So you can try to justify a belief okay, in all sorts of ways, but you cannot know with certainty that it okay, is true. So the set of justified true beliefs okay, from the standpoint of the human being, okay, is an empty set.
Hmm.
So I didn't want to deal with empty sets. Okay, so I ended up with but basically but Karl Popper's ideas concerning the theory of truth, and how he related that to
Oops.
coherence by theory of truth
So you said you
and
wrote a monograph?
coherence testing. Well, actually, I wrote. What I wrote was a monograph on the subject, and I also wrote two books that were published, okay, by Butterworth Heinemann. Okay, that's an imprint of Elsevier, which in turn is a division, okay, of the Taylor Company, okay, I believe, okay, at this point. But these books were pretty successful in the knowledge management field. As an academic, primarily doing work in the knowledge management field, okay, I still have a rating, okay, at ResearchGate of something like 16.72, which was somewhere in the middle, okay, of all researchers. And I haven't really done any work, okay, in knowledge management since I became hotly converted to MMT in 2010. I've been,
Oh,
all the work I've been doing during that time, practically all of
wow.
it, okay, has been okay in economics, except for one project, okay, that I can talk to you about that has come to a
Okay,
standstill.
so smoothest
But I'm not going to
transition.
go
So
into
late
that.
late 1990s, you
Okay,
got into
so
you're
I'm
ready
going to
to, and
smooth
then
the
then
transition.
2010. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to smooth the transition, but what I want to do is show you some books, okay, because they were important. Okay,
Okay.
okay, I'll be right back. They're behind me in the library here. So, where's the Francis X. Kavanaugh?
I'm asking people out there, is the volume okay for between both of us now? Is it better?
Okay, so the three books I'm talking about, I encountered while I was doing the database marketing work, and as I was moving into the data warehousing work. And there was a book called, I think, The Misunderstood Economy, and it was by a guy by the name of Eisner. Okay, his first name, okay, is Robert Eisner, and he was someone highly respected by the MMTers. Okay, I later learned, in particular, Matt Forstater, okay, and Stephanie Kelton had a very, very high opinion, okay, of Robert Eisner. Okay, and he was the president of the American Economics Association, I guess, for a few years. And he was also, at one time, he was a teacher, okay, of Bill Clinton. And in the early years of the Clinton administration, he was brought in to do some consulting, but he fell out of favor with the Clinton administration because, of course, when it came to deficit spending and things like that, he was, extremely expansive, and in particular, he knew the truth about Social Security funding, and he knew the truth about he knew the truth about deficit spending, that it doesn't actually get you into trouble. And I guess I ran into the misunderstood economy in 1996. Okay, and I read that book, and I read it at about the same time that I read this book, which was called, it was like a 1994 book or a 1995 book, and it was called The Deficit Lie. Okay, kind of a similar title to Stephanie's book, which is about to be released, right? This one was written by Rick Boettger, but actually Betger. Okay, is his name. Okay, after he wrote this book, it was a big disappointment to him in terms of the sales of the book and in terms of where, okay, it got him. But by profession, he was not an economist. He had a PhD, but he had a PhD in, in business administration. So he wasn't, okay, an academic economist. But The Deficit Lie is a very, very good book. Okay, and in fact, it was so good that Eisner actually wrote, okay, an introduction to it, or the preface to the book, I guess it was. Yeah, I think he wrote the preface to the book. But no, he couldn't have written the preface. Did he write the introduction? He did something. Okay, I guess he wrote a blurb for the book or something like that. He was a supporter of it. However, yeah, he says on the back, I welcome the deficit lie, a rather wild, rambunctious, okay, and a rather provocative polemic as a significant addition to the efforts to dispel national myths and dogma. It does ignore or contradict some sensible types of economic analysis, but makes up for it by exposing much conventional nonsense. And so it was actually this book that led me to Eisner's work. And it was published in 1994. And I think Eisner's book was also published roughly in by 1994, just after the Clinton administration kicked him out. In the early part of the Clinton administration, there was a fight between people who wanted to be progressive in their spending. Okay, and this included Robert Reich, okay, who was the Secretary of Labor, okay, in that administration, and Hillary Clinton, by the way. in those days. Okay, and also Eisner in his role as a consultant to the Clinton administration.
Which
And,
I mean, it's
and
really, it just makes it even worse at how neoliberal Clinton is now that we know that he knows.
right. So what happened was there was a fight there. That group of people had a fight with another group that was led by the Secretary of the Treasury in the Clinton administration, who was actually Bob Rubin, who was a neoliberal par excellence and was responsible for the economic course taken by the administration and largely responsible for putting Clinton on the track of having those surpluses as his final 4 years in office. The
Yep.
surpluses that, as you know, caused the recession of 2000 to 2000, okay, and two. Okay, so it was Rubin who caused this, and it was Rubin who attracted Obama in I guess it was in 2004 or 2005 to the Citigroup people and the think tanks they were supporting. Okay, and he introduced Obama to those people. Okay, and to the Hamilton Group and the people who were working through the public option for health care. Okay, and all that sort of stuff. Okay, so Rubin's had a terrible effect, okay, on American politics, okay, and economics over the years. Just a
Hmm.
terrible effect, okay, in various ways, including turning Obama towards a highly neoliberal point of view. I'm not sure that actually required, okay, a lot of effort because I think Obama, in some ways was a Reaganite anyway. So it was easy for Rubin to talk the sense, his brand of sense, to Obama, which of course is neoliberal common sense. Okay, is what I'm talking
Right.
about here, which, as we know,
Right.
is faux fiscal responsibility, deficit hawkism, okay, and all that.
Right.
Then I read
Hey,
another
Joe.
book about
Joe,
that time too.
if I may, if we could wrap up this up and for how you got into MMT in within maybe 10 minutes or so, so we can
We can certainly do
enough
that.
time
Okay,
have
yeah,
enough time to get into
right.
the generic subjects. Okay.
Yeah, we can certainly do that. So here's another book. This one is called the national debt. Okay, let me see if I can get that into my camera. The truth about the national debt. Fiscal myths and one reality is the subtitle. This was written by Francis X. Kavanaugh, and that one was also another book that was written in 1996. The other two were written in 94, I believe. This one was written in 96, and it asked such questions as, do we know why we hate the deficit? And then he talked about some myths. Myth number one, the debt burden on future generations. He considered that to be a myth. Myth number two, crowding out. He considered that, okay, to be a myth
Wow, this sounds like Mosler's book.
in some ways. Myth number three, the unsustainable interest burden. Myth number four, the inequitable interest burden. Myth number five, the foreign threat. Myth number, chapter seven, the federal preemption of credit markets. Myth number eight, the national debt and Social Security. Why the myths persist. The reality, spending control. And he had some ideas on spending control. But but Kavanaugh was an official, I believe, it's been a long time since I looked at this, a writer and public finance consultant, was the first executive director and CEO at the Federal Retirement Bank, uh, Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board. And he also spent some time in the Treasury Department. He was responsible for debt management policy advice in the Treasury Department. So he was a Treasury Department official too, okay, at one point. And so he knew about the system from the inside, and he wrote this book, okay, in '96. I read these three books at that time in the middle of getting into my data warehousing stuff, and I was very impressed with them. Okay, I was very taken with them. Now let's skip. Let's skip over the knowledge management period, okay, and the data warehousing period, and go to when I began to blog. I was caught up, okay, in the Obama campaign. And like everybody, I won't say, okay, like everybody else, but like quite a number of people, was quite taken with the audacity of hope.
Me too.
Okay. So I came in very, very hopeful in 2000, okay, in 8. And I began to move away from my work, okay, in knowledge management. I began to share my blog in that area with some politics blogs. I started blogging on the political situation, on the election, on what was going on in the Congress. And then 2008 actually moved over to 2009, and gradually the knowledge management stuff simply went away because I got so absorbed in the politics. In particular, so absorbed in the health insurance reform fights. I got very absorbed in that. And of course,
Okay.
because I read these other books, I never believed in the fiscal responsibility crap, didn't know how to critique it, okay, but I never believed in it, okay, I never bought it. And I never bought the arguments against having a Medicare for All program. I was blogging all through that time in favor of the Medicare for All program and H.R. 676, which was John Conyers' bill back then, that particular version of H.R. 676. And I was blogging at Fire Dog Lake and blogging on my own blog, okay, and blogging, okay, at Daily Costs. And I was writing like 2, 3 blogs a day. I was up to
Whoa.
my ears in that fight. And
Wow.
long blogs too. I almost never do short blogs, as
Sounds like Bill Mitchell.
so many people know.
And coincidentally around when he started too.
There is nobody like Bill Mitchell. First of all, he generally does only one blog a day. But
Well,
that
it's a heck of a
blog
blog.
is so chock full of information, and it's so long, and it's so authoritative. I mean, Bill is just unequaled in the depth of his blogging and what he has to say. I
And
mean,
what's remarkable is that he'll even, like, something you'll write 10 years ago, you'll say, "Oh, that was mistaken," whatever, whatever.
no, I never
I've
say
never
that.
seen that with him. I've never seen that with him. Like, he'll refer to a blog from like 2009 as authoritative as they are today.
Well, one of my favorite things to do when I'm having a question about an obscure point, okay, of MMT, is to spend hours searching his site and going back through the old blogs, because I'm pretty sure that one time or another he has addressed it and he has
Sure.
solved that particular problem.
Okay, so how did you discover MMT? Your pump
Okay.
was primed with these three books,
And
and
also my interest, okay, in Medicare for All, and generally, okay, my interest in paying for progressive programs. I was
Mhm.
all primed. Then at the end of 2009, I had run into this lady whose handle was Celise. and she was blogging at Fire Dog Lake, and that's where I ran into her. Okay, and we were both we were for a Medicare for All program, extremely interested in it, and we had very similar perspectives. Okay, in in very many ways. And along about November, she told me about this guy Warren Mosler and the seven deadly innocent frauds.
Yep.
And
That
uh,
must have that must have been like, wow, I feel like I already read this.
well, it rang a bell, and I got around to actually getting it in December of 2000, okay, and 9. And then it rang all kinds of bells because I'd read these earlier books. Okay, these earlier books,
It all these pieces finally came together
all
because of
these
Bill Mitchell, I presume.
pieces really came together because of Warren
Oh, because of Warren's
and the
book.
seven deadly innocent frauds. It all
So how did you
clicked
discover that
then.
book?
Okay,
How did you
it,
discover
it
that
was through
book?
Solis
Solis.
who gave me a link to that book.
Hmm.
So it was through my connections at Fire Dog Lake that I was turned on to that book.
Well, that's a 2010 book, and so then you set up
Oh
this
no, it wasn't.
2010.
Oh no, it wasn't a 2010 book. The first time I read it was the free version late in 2000, okay, and 9.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
So,
and okay, I read that, and I read a copy of Soft Currency Economics at that time too. Okay, so
I
I
think
read them
Pavlina was
both.
somehow involved in that.
I think that she was a research assistant, okay, to Warren. Both Stephanie, okay, and Pavlina as well, at one time or another, served as research assistants to Warren,
Okay.
which is funny, strange, but that's the way okay, it happened, I guess. So okay, it happened, I think, through grants that Warren was making to Levy Institute, okay, and to UMKC also. In other words, he gave grants, okay, to both of the programs, and they were substantial because he was feeling very flush. Okay, in those days, he had made, 300 million, using his theories,
Sure.
and he was feeling, of course, very, very enthusiastic about the MMT ideas that he was working out with
The
Bill,
first
okay,
half
and
of
Randy,
the first half
and
of the Seven Deadly Innocent Frauds is how he used that knowledge before anyone else sort of realized it to make money for his companies.
yes.
So how does this work up to this, I believe, 2010 conference that you
Okay, well, of
organized?
course,
Which was,
what
I think,
happened
the
there,
yeah.
okay,
Go
what
ahead. Go ahead.
happened there was that the first thing I did, okay, in MMT was to write 3 blogs on Warren's book. Those are my first 3 publications in the MMT area.
Hmm.
Okay, and I spread that all over the place, and I did those 3 blogs initially back then, and then later on, okay, I enhanced the 3 blogs. I came back later, I think, okay, a year or two later, okay, and I did it again because I loved that book. So it was hard for me to keep my hands off it, and I went back to it, okay, again and again and again, and to soft currency economics also. And so then, of course, through his site and also Solis, I got turned on to Bill's blog, okay, and the UMKC blog at that time was just starting up, so I got turned on to that, okay, as well. And I was blogging a lot, okay, about MMT, I guess. Okay, I blogged some in January, February, and March, okay, about it, while I still was blogging, okay, on Medicare for All, okay, and other political issues. But I
Hmm.
was picking up the basics of MMT at that time and writing about it, okay, at the same time, okay. And okay, then uh, in the first part, okay, of April, something like April 5th or something like that, I heard about this Peterson Fiscal Summit
Ah. Hmm.
that was going to be going on, okay, on April 28th, and that had a connection to the Obama administration and deficit hawkism and the whole business of advocating for austerity in federal fiscal policy. And I instantly saw the problem with that. Okay, of course. And my early blogs in 2009 are still out there, okay, on my blog site. And some of those early blogs, okay, are at daily cost. Also, they would be at Fire Dog Lake, except that Fire Dog Lake went defunct. They succumbed to a software hacker attack, actually, by rightists. And they
Oh,
took down
wow.
the whole site and they basically ended it.
Wow.
Uh, there's a there's a follow-on institution right now called Shadowproof that got some of the assets, okay, at Fire Dog Lake. But lots of the early blogs, okay, are inaccessible now, and a lot of them were really priceless, in terms of the debates, okay, that
Did
went
you
on.
lose important stuff during that?
Well, I lost important stuff in terms of having, a home on the web for it, but
Did your content is preserved?
uh, you can still find the content, okay, because it also appeared, okay, on my site. But
Okay.
the debates that went on, okay, at Fire Dog Lake on it, on the Medicare for All stuff, we had debates with, 277 comments in there, detailed comments, heavy people, on Medicare for All. There were just, fights all over the place on that. And at Correnti Wire as well, and I was blogging over there too, basically reposting the same blog, okay, in a number of, places. And
That's the
Correnti
guy from
Wire, okay, is already down. Yeah, Lambert
that's
Streeter.
yeah, right, who's involved with naked capitalism.
Yes, in other words, he got involved with naked capitalism, which at least had a little bit of pay, okay, attached to it. And so he got to the point where he didn't feel it, paid any longer to keep up his own blog. And so he ended that. And a lot of great material was on that blog also from other authors, okay, not just from him. So a couple of the sites at which I published, are gone now. Now, that's not really so important because you can still get the blogs, if not the commentary, at my site, which is still up, and also at Daily Costs, where I blogged for a long time under my handle, which is Let's Get It Done. Okay, was the handle, okay, I used then, especially when I was coming
That's the
out,
URL
okay,
to your
with
Facebook
knowledge.
page too.
Right, okay, it is. So, and that actually came from 2008 politics and 2009 politics, and what I wanted to get done was the progressive agenda, of course, and
Right.
in particular Medicare for All.
So
So
where
that
does
was
this
the reference of that.
2010? I believe you created a conference as a competitor to this Pete Peterson
Yeah,
conference.
what
So how does
happened
that?
is that I got the idea, okay, on April 5th or thereabouts, and I took the idea to Fire Dog Lake and also to the Correnti Wire to try to somehow get support for it and raise some funds for it. Okay, and there was great interest in the idea. Okay, it never got completely off the ground at Fire Dog Lake, but there were a number of people who got so interested in it that they basically went over from Fire Dog Lake to Corrente Wire to organize it. So the organizing site for the Fiscal Sustainability Teaching Counter Conference was actually at the Corrente Wire. And the conference was organized by myself, okay, and by Lambert Streether, okay, and also by Solis, okay, who was part of the group. And there were a few other people involved. Hipparchia, okay, and Alice Marshall, okay, a few other people, okay, were involved in that too. We had a team of 6 people that put together this fiscal sustainability conference with the vocal support, okay, of Jamie Galbraith between the 5th of April and April 28th, like in 25 days.
Wow.
We put together this conference. We raised, however, only $5,500, and we really needed to raise $10,000 to cover all the expenses. So some of the MMTers came at their own expense.
Wow.
Warren came at his expense. Okay, Marshall Auerbach came, okay, at his expense. In Bill Mitchell's case, he really needed to come first class, okay, because he got involved in a surfing accident.
Oh.
Hurt himself, and he was in pain. So he had to get, okay, a business class ticket. Unfortunately, all I had in my budget was for a tourist class ticket. So he basically funded part of his expenses to come
Wow.
from Australia, and ended up $1,500 short.
Wow.
Okay, essentially. So, uh, okay, the other expenses I was able to handle with the 5,500. Okay, that we had gotten. I was able to pay for George Washington and for the food and the coffee and those kinds of things, and the audio visual stuff and all that sort of stuff. It would have been just a little more comfortable if we'd been able to raise the 10,000 though for that conference. Anyway, it was a full day conference.
One day?
Yes, okay, it was a 1 day conference, and the slides for it are still up on the web.
Wow.
The presentations, okay, are on YouTube, okay, and also at the site, okay, that we used, okay, in order to display that. The transcripts, okay, are up there. We did transcripts for it, okay, as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and a lot of the ideas and a lot of the disputes, okay, a lot of the issues that you see today surrounding MMT were raised at that conference by the audience at that conference. And the MMTers handled those issues in much the same way they handle them today, 10 years later.
Wow.
It's to go over the proceedings of this conference is just extremely illuminating. After the conference, of course, I became very, very active in MMT blogging. All I did was blog MMT
Wow.
for
That's
a
great.
long, long time. And of course, I became a regular blogger for a while at the UMKC site, which
Mm-hmm.
I probably would be a blogger still today if Stephanie was still the editor. I'd probably still be a blogger there today. But I stopped actually blogging there. I think officially I still can blog there, okay, if I want to. But I stopped because the editing turnaround became 2 or 3 days. And a lot of my blog posts at the time, this was back in 2015, were on very current things. I was blogging a lot, okay, about the TPP and stuff like that, and that was
Sure.
right in the middle of the fight over the
Sure.
TPP.
Yeah.
So,
Of
I mean, I
course.
wasn't going to wait around for 3 days to, see a blog appear because its relevance was as of the first day. I mean, I needed a few
Right.
hours, and sometimes the editor just was too busy to, review the stuff and approve it for publication.
Right.
Uh, in a few hours, and that was the time, okay, I needed. So I stopped, blogging there as a result, and I started, okay, a blog, okay, of my own that I blogged very frequently on until uh, the middle of 2018. And then at that point, I just decided to go full on live streaming.
Hmm.
And,
So that's when you started that. Okay.
and since then, I haven't had too much time to write. I started live streaming actually because Steve Grumbine asked me to.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So okay, started blogging. I started the live streaming, okay, as an RPer, and I was doing that, okay, for a long time. Okay, and I stopped that, for reasons internal to RP and the way, okay, it ran, and I was part, okay, of a larger group, and we just didn't want to have a part
We
of
don't
the.
need to go on that.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, we don't need to
so,
go there.
well, let me ask you. Okay, so we've been going now an hour and 15, which is I think this has been a really well-rounded thing. This has been great, and actually, I'm pretty sure it's Christian Riley. I interviewed him on the day of the UK election, and I'm pretty sure that your conference was central to his discovering MMT.
Oh, that's
that
interesting.
he that he encountered a video from your conference and was interested in finding transcripts, or opposite, actually, maybe I think he saw transcripts on naked capitalism and was very interested in finding the videos, and then he encountered your conference, and that's what his, if I remember correctly, that's what his entrance into MMT was. So that's really great. um, if I may, if you wouldn't mind, if we could switch into, I'd like to spend the rest of the time picking your brain
Go ahead.
and getting into some specific topics. Okay. Okay. The first topic I would like to get into is something that I hear all the time, and I'm missing something. I'm missing the nature of it, and that is how the Federal Reserve defends interest rates. I don't really understand what the nature of that is, what the importance of that is, and what happens if what's the consequences if they don't, you know, if they don't defend it properly. Like, I know it has to do with reserves, and banks trade within themselves and overnight, but I don't understand the nature of that, and I was hoping that you could like explain it like for a child kind of a thing, because I hear this all the time. They're just defending interest rates. They're just defending interest rates, but I really don't get what that really means. But even more of like what I just don't understand. I'm missing something, and I have always been missing something with that. So I was wondering if you could just go into what that means from like a really basic point of view.
Okay, so from a basic point of view, the interest rates, the overnight interest rate in the market, okay, the interbank market for funds, the overnight rate is the price, okay, of money. It's the price you have to pay to borrow money, okay, in that particular market. So do you
A
understand that?
Well, this is so the banks can buy reserves from other banks on this private interbank market, correct?
Right. Okay.
So there's a reserve requirement,
There's a
which in Canada
reserve
is
requirement.
zero, but where we have whatever it is, 10%. And if they have less than that, then they're breaking the law, and I guess they could have to pay a penalty. But they also don't want to be too much higher than that because they can't make money on those extra funds. They want to be able to maximize their profit and use that extra portion to make money on it.
Okay. Well, I don't know if that's so much the situation, but what okay it initially has to do with is that uh, when they can't meet the particular requirements, okay, and we have to specify first of all that when they make a loan to people, they do not pay attention to the requirement. In other words, they
Right.
lend money
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
people based on the credit worthiness, okay, of the person in terms of their standards.
Right. So when they make a loan to somebody, they don't, loans create deposits, and and so when they create a loan, that essentially it's bi-weekly or every couple of days or something like that. And in order to manage that, they can purchase reserves from another or borrow reserves from another bank, and that
Okay,
interest
wait,
rate
wait,
is
wait.
is
Okay, before we get into purchasing the reserves, okay, so they're making loans, okay, throughout, a particular day. I mean, Wells Fargo is making loans to all kinds of people, okay, during the day, okay.
right.
Okay, then there are settlements at night. Each night things, okay, are settled.
And settle means that when a paycheck goes from one bank to like a Wells Fargo company gives a paycheck to somebody, it's given to whatever another bank, not Wells Fargo, that it doesn't instantaneously settle, and later that night the reserves are transferred to reflect that paycheck, for example. Is
Right.
that
So
okay?
that may leave a bank, after all that happens, that may leave a bank in a violation of the requirement to hold the particular amount of the actual Federal Reserves.
Right.
Okay, so then, okay, if they are below the requirement, they have to find the money at some point. Okay, they have some time to do it, but within a particular time frame, they have to borrow the money to get back into line.
To get
Okay,
the
and
proper reserve requirement.
yes, and the way they do that is they go into the interbank market to borrow funds. So the price of funds in the interbank this market is the price that they have to pay to get those funds. The interest rate sets the price.
So they want to borrow 1,000 as a 2% rate. They have to pay 1,020 from that bank in order to have those reserves switch over.
Well, okay, it's 2% annually. Okay,
Two
in other
percent
words, the
annually.
interest rate, right? Okay, okay, it's an annual rate, so it's a very small amount. Okay, on a daily basis, but of course, they're trading in millions and millions and millions, and even these very big banks, billions of dollars. So these fractions of a percent are real money, and they watch that because that cuts into their profits when they're paying the interest
I
for it.
actually know, actually, Scott Fallweiler uh, posted a podcast where it was said that $5 trillion every single day moves through the Federal Reserve System,
Right.
which I think is somewhat related to what you're saying.
Yes, it is. Okay, so
Every
when they
day, every
go
day.
into the interbank market, they're borrowing the money at the lowest possible cost, the lowest possible price. So the overnight rate, which is set by the Federal Reserve, that's a policy variable set by the Federal Reserve, the
Policy
Board of
variable means
Governors.
arbitrary human decision.
Well, it's a human decision, whether it's arbitrary or not, but it's a human decision. Okay, it's not a market.
Right.
Okay, it's a regulative but decision set by the Board of Governors and uh, actually the Board of Governors. Okay, is setting it. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so uh, that's the lowest price that these banks have to pay. Okay, in order to get into compliance with the actual requirement.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, sometimes, sometimes this market actually freezes up, and there are no reserves available at that rate specified by the Board of Governors, and some banks then can't get the reserves they need.
Okay.
But so what do? Well, the Federal Reserve has a backstop for that. It has something called the discount window,
That's the
which is no
backstop for when banks
which is no
cannot.
longer a physical discount window. Okay, it's an electronic window these days, I'm certain. But what they do is they go to the Federal Reserve and they say, "Hey, okay, I can't borrow any reserves in the interbank market, and I got to meet my requirement. So I got to borrow the reserves from you." This has two consequences, okay, for the bank. It doesn't look good for a bank to have to do that. There's a prestige kind of thing. Oh, we don't want to have to go because we're sort of admitting that we're kind of weak, because we don't have the reserve levels we should have. So they don't like to go to the discount window. And then the other problem is if they go to the discount window, they do have to pay a little more in interest. The price of money is a little higher at the discount window, than it is um, uh, uh, in terms of the market rate that is set by the Fed in the overnight market. So you pay a little bit of a penalty, in actually going to the discount window, and then of course eats into your profits. And if you're trading a lot, and you're having this problem a lot, and you're going to the discount window a lot, it eats into your bank capital. So it's not good. So it's important from the Fed's point of view. It's important for them to actually keep plenty of reserves in the overnight market, so the rate that they set can actually be met through the banks freely borrowing money from each other. And when the Federal Reserve says that there's a liquidity crisis, one of the aspects of a liquidity crisis is that the interbank market is getting frozen up.
There's not enough reserves to go around in order
Not
for
enough
all the banks to meet
reserves.
the reserve account,
Not enough
reserve
reserves,
requirement.
okay, to go around. And so that's when the Federal Reserve says, hey, maybe we better start creating some new money out of thin air and trading the new reserves for bank assets that the banks are holding, like the federal bonds the banks are holding and the mortgage securities the banks, are holding. And so that's when they get into talking about injecting money into the markets, the
So
Fed
so
injecting money into the markets.
and as I understand it, with the coronavirus going on right now, that it's like they've done it. They did a trillion point, a 1.5 trillion a few days ago or last week, which helped them for like 30 minutes apparently or something. And now they're considering $1 trillion every single day, at least for a while. And
Yeah, because the
maybe a couple of
markets are
months ago,
seizing
there
up.
was some. So maybe a couple of months ago, something similar to this happened. Maybe 3, 4 months ago, and Nathan Tankis wrote something very important, a thread on what specifically was going on. I just wasn't aware of the details enough to really soak that in, but I have a feeling that that was also related to this. Nathan, I remember, wrote a very long, detailed Twitter thread that went a little bit viral that really described of what was going on. Now I want to go back and read it again. I have a feeling that this is related to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
You don't recall that? Um, uh,
But I don't think I saw that particular Twitter thread, as a
okay,
matter of
okay.
fact.
I want to
Okay,
look for
but
that, Nathan.
if Nathan wrote it, I'm sure that it's very good.
um, okay, so the reason that this is happening, well, no, let me say the reason that they're pumping money into the system, $1 trillion a day or 1.5 trillion, I can only guess is because they're the people are they're giving out loans, or they gave out loans that people suddenly can't pay back. That has
Yes.
something to do with it? Yes. Okay. Okay. And then that reflects, so their decision of giving that loan may have been a bad decision, or maybe it wasn't a bad decision, but the government didn't prepare for this crisis. So it turned out to be a bad decision because we'd never prepared for this crisis. And then that means that there's not enough reserves to go around for all banks to meet their reserve requirements
Right, because the banks are losing reserves, and that sort of thing. They're losing capital.
because people are not able to pay back their loans, right? Because actual
When
people are not
people
able to pay back their
when
loans.
people are defaulting on their loans, the banks have actual losses. There are real world losses
Okay.
involved in that.
So this injecting money to cover these reserve requirements is a reflection of things really starting to go wrong out there somewhere. And
It
that
could be
they have
that, but also it might not be just in terms of having a recession. It may be the banks have lent too much, and there's been a speculative bubble, and the paper values of things have simply gotten out of line. And the musical chairs are stopping, and businesses are starting to fail. So
which is
then
just
they're failing to pay their loans back, and
okay.
therefore they're starting to cut into the capital. Banks. In other words, banks can get overextended in that they lend far too much for their capital base to support their lending. They're basically speculating on future profits, which they never realize, the profits that they're anticipating from the loans that they put out there.
And now coronavirus has really thrown, has really stopped up the works, but it has stopped up the works way worse than it would have had the government prepared better for this crisis for over the past 40 years and not screw people for the past 40 years. So this is not necessarily bad decisions on the part of the bank. I'm sure it significantly is, and I'm sure there's criminality and screwing people. But this is also a reflection on. I'm guessing that this is also a reflection on 40 years of neoliberalism and not preparing, and manufacturing being sent overseas,
Absolutely,
and are
absolutely.
not preparing for this crisis, basically assuming that this
Right,
crisis would
and
never happen.
also companies buying back their own stock.
Okay, can you explain that part of it?
Okay, some of the banks take their capital okay, or take a part of their capital. Okay, not simply banks, but big businesses of all kinds, and to drive up the price of their stock on the stock market, they buy back their own stock. In other words, increase the demand for their own stock. Supply and demand.
So they're hiding,
It drives the price of the stock up.
and
And
they're
what,
and this is partially an effort to hide things that are going wrong. I'm pretty sure
it's
that that's true.
partially, yes, partially an effort to hide things, okay, that are going wrong in certain instances. In some instances, okay, it's an effort to drive up the price. So the paper value of the stock options they gave to the executives, okay, is greater,
Yeah,
and the
yeah.
executives maybe can sell stock and get more in pay and stuff like that. So it's about enriching the people who both are owners and executives, okay, of the banks.
So if
Enriching
I'm
the top
understanding this
executives.
correctly, and this actually relates to, I did a month's worth of research, and I did my, I've done well over 100 interviews at this point, but I've never done a just me talking except for once, and that once was I did a podcast for Historically where I just spoke for like an hour and 15 minutes on this book called, oh darn it, what was it called? Retirement Heist.
Yeah.
Retirement Heist. Do you know that book?
I've heard of it.
Oh my
Who
gosh!
wrote it? Who wrote it?
I can't think at the moment, but I could find it very quickly. It's Retirement Heist. It is about the American pension system and how it's just a hundred of companies just stealing from their workers to enrich their executives. And so, what I'm thinking what you're saying with these stock buybacks is that the value of the stock is going down. So let's say there's 100 pieces of stock. I forget what the terminology is. There's 100 pieces of shares. So there's 100 shares, and those shares, the value of those shares go down. So they buy back 50 of them, so that the remaining 50 have that. So let's say the 100 shares is worth $1,000. They buy back 50 of them. So now the remaining 50 are on average worth more,
Right.
and that raised stock value directly affects executive compensation. So they're manipulating their own wealth. They're just buying back stock in order to increase their own compensation. I
Right.
believe that that's correct. Yeah,
Okay. And the book was written by Ellen E. Schultz.
Ellen Schultz. It is an amazing book. I'll put a link to the podcast in the comments.
Okay.
It's extraordinary. Hold on a sec. Retirement Heist link comments. Okay. Um, okay. So going back, so that is just an example of things going wrong in the real world,
Yes.
and that this is magnified because the government doesn't regulate properly. It doesn't have laws. It just allows a wild west of rich people stealing from everybody else.
Right.
And so this is happening on a mass scale, which is resulting in people defaulting on their loans and companies defaulting on their loans. So banks now have less reserves, and so now they're struggling on this interbank overnight market to purchase loan. There's not enough for all the banks to get their overnight to get their reserve requirements, and that's happening on such a mass scale. Now we're talking about $1 trillion a day. And so what's the extreme of this? I mean, I'm guessing that this is a reflection of like a single bank gives out loans and everybody defaults on their loans, and all of those people are suffering because they can't pay back their loans. And I'm guessing that this is just on a mass scale when you're thinking of the Federal Reserve and all of their customers, the banks, are starting to default on their loans. Like, what is the extreme of this? Because the Federal
The
Reserve,
extreme of this is like.
well, hold on a moment, Joe. The Federal Reserve can keep on injecting money, keep on injecting money over and over and over again. And I think 2008 somehow gave them the permission. They did something in 2008, and a result of the 2008 to give them the permission to do this. So what's stopping them from just keeping doing this, and what are they hiding, and what's going to be the explosion when it doesn't work anymore?
Okay, what's stopping them is that there are these tests that the banks have to go through periodically. And these tests have something to do with the capital position of the banks, and not simply, okay, the reserve position of the banks. Should enough of this go on in terms of losses, the implication of it is that the banks can lose so much money that they no longer can pass the solvency tests.
Okay, and so they could just change the solvency test, just hypothetically.
They
They
could
make up the
change the
rules. They
solvency
could.
tests. Yes, they could change the solvency tests, uh, but there comes a point when the banks, whose records to some degree have to be public, are seen by the public to be insolvent. And then that shakes the confidence of the public.
Okay, and then they all go to the bank and say, "I want my money."
Uh, oh, that can lead to panics. Okay, it can lead to situations, okay, where the depositors, okay, are withdrawing money in spite of the fact that their money is uh, under the protection of the federal government. Okay, but it simply creates a situation where the banks are seen to be bankrupt, and therefore the possibility is there that they may decide to declare bankruptcy.
The bank, the
Yeah, the
bank.
bank may decide to declare bankruptcy. There were many smaller banks in the great financial crash that did go under.
In
That did,
2008.
yeah, in the 2008 financial crash.
I I know that they allowed that like a couple of companies to go under, but otherwise they bailed them all out with whatever $26 trillion.
Yes, they bailed them all out, and with the loan money, they created a situation where the banks were able to gain tremendous advantage between the cost of money that they were paying with respect to the overnight rates and
You
the
actually
cost.
you just something just the sound went a little weird. They gained tremendous what?
Okay, they gained a tremendous advantage, the
Advantage.
arbitrage advantage. In other words, their cost of money from the interbank market, which was being supported by the Federal Reserve with all the liquidity that the Federal Reserve was throwing into this market. Okay, then the banks turned around through their credit card companies and through their loans, and for a while, for years, were earning, okay, enormous profits. In other words, they would, even right now, the credit card companies are charging an average rate to people of 20 to 21% in terms of credit card interest. The people who've run up large sums, okay, in credit, they're paying 20 to 21%.
Right.
The cost of money to those banks is close to zero right now.
Right.
So what's the arbitrage on that? The arbitrage on that is 20 to 21% on these loans.
Arbitrage is basically leverage.
It's the gross profit they're getting.
Oh, profit. Profit. Okay.
The gross profit. Yeah, the arbitrage, okay, is the leverage, but the end result of the arbitrage is the profits.
And this is an example of basically criminality that that they can just steal from their customers.
Well, they have the power to set the interest rates because the credit card companies do not really compete very strongly. If they competed very strongly, we would see interest rates now at 2 and 3%. We ain't seeing that, right? I mean, the credit card interest rates, if you want to lower the credit card interest rates, that's going to have to be regulated. Okay, that's going to have to be capped. Okay, because the banks that are running the companies, okay, the credit card companies, are now paying less than 1% on the cost of money, and the credit card companies are charging, the 21%. So obviously they're not competing with each other. There's not an open market when it comes to credit card interest rates.
Okay, I have a question about that, but I actually want to read a comment. Russell just said in the comments, I went to the bank today and the lobby is closed to traffic without an appointment, which makes sense with the coronavirus. The drive-through was pretty packed. There does seem to be some, in his opinion, there does seem to be some level of panic with the
Yeah,
COVID-19 lockdown.
sure.
So you said banks don't compete with one another. I
Okay,
mean,
I'm
that's
saying the
just
credit card companies don't.
credit card companies don't compete with one another because it's a collusion. I'm guessing it's a collusion that they can just screw everyone together. They can just steal from people. There's no laws to stop them from stealing from people. There's no enforcement of existing laws to stop them from stealing from people. So, but these are just all examples of
The real basic point here is that there isn't a free market in the credit card industry. There are a few major players that dominate the market through their marketing power to the public. Okay, and so they can raise interest rates as high as the traffic will bear, and so they do. So over the years, they've raised them up to an average, of 20%, and people who get into real trouble are paying 24 to but 28% even.
you said that the interest rates can go as high as what? As something will allow? I didn't catch what you said.
Uh, I said they can charge as much as the traffic
Traffic will
will
allow.
bear, as the traffic will bear.
Right, which
Okay,
is
in
just
other
as
words, you get it to the point where it's so high that people simply can't pay it and they default. And then you start losing capital. Okay.
oh, okay. So they ride this wave of screwing people to the maximum, but not so much that, everybody just collapses instantaneously. So, okay, so this is just another example of basically criminality and of, rich stealing from the masses to enrich themselves. And it's just another example of all this. So getting back to these interest rates on the Federal Reserve, well, first of all, why would a bank declare bankruptcy? Well, that means that why would a bank declare bankruptcy when they have the power of the Federal Reserve behind them? Why would the Federal Reserve
Well, if
want
it's a
to allow a
relatively
bank
small
to go
bank,
bankrupt?
if it's happens to be a relatively small bank, then the Federal Reserve may not be supporting it. In other words, there were many small community banks that actually went under during the crisis and in the aftermath of the crisis. And I guess that was because the same facilities were not available to them as were available to Citicorp and to Wells Fargo, and to Chase,
The big banks.
yeah, the J.P. Morgan Chase, and so on. In other words, the really big banks had access to the 29 million, and the credit facilities which were discovered by Randy's students. And by the way, that 29 million wasn't the end of the story. In other words, that was by something like
29 million trillion.
trillion. Yeah, that was by 2012, I think, or 2011.
And I
But
believe that was due to a Bernie Sanders request or amendment to do an audit of the Fed.
uh, I can't recall whether that's how they found it, but the point, okay, I'm making here is that they didn't stop using the credit facilities in 2011 or 2012. This has gone on. We don't know what the total amount of credit facilities they've used happens to be at this point in time. They've probably been using those credit facilities all through the last 10 years.
Right.
It was
Okay.
29 trillion back in 2011 or 2012. It could be 60
Mm,
trillion by now in credit facilities that they've been using.
okay. So defending the interest rates. So they can keep pumping in $1 trillion a day, whatever, and at some point it's going to get bigger than that. And I mean, there's nothing stopping them from pumping in $10 trillion a day. They can do whatever they like. I would presume that the number doesn't matter. The number of digits doesn't matter. But at some
No,
point,
not to
what?
them. They simply mark it up on the computer.
Correct, right. So they can keep doing this to orders of magnitude, but at some point, what real world consequences happens? I mean, we're talking about that now. It's being spoken that we might have between 30 and 50% unemployment because of this crisis. So, like, what at what point does that fail, and what is the nature of that failure?
Okay, they can still keep, if the Federal Reserve wants to do it, okay, and if the political system will support them, they can keep the private banks going all through this. Or if the political winds change and people say, no more bailing out to the banks, which of course people at some point are going to do, then it'll be time
Oh.
for the federal government to take the banks into resolution and take them over.
So So this is basically they could keep doing this to any scale. Obviously, they could do it $100 trillion a day. They could do a $250 a day. It doesn't matter because they have the power of the computer. As long as the cell in the spreadsheet is big enough, they can handle that many digits.
But it
But
matters
but this
politically. Okay, it
but
matters
but this
politically.
but this is basically permission to keep screwing people. That's what it seems. That's actually what it seems like. This is permission to
It's
keep screwing
permission for
people.
the freeloaders to continue to freeload and to screw people while they're doing it. And
Wow. So
at some point, the people are going to turn around, okay, and they're going to say, "Look, this is not in accordance with the public purpose. Take the bastards into resolution."
okay. Wow. Okay. I
So that's
so
the real world consequence. The real world consequence is, when are we going to decide we've had enough, okay, of this crap? In other words, if people play this game and they lose all their capital, they are guilty of mismanaging their business, and these businesses should be taken away from them. That's what we do with other private enterprises. I mean, okay, in other fields, in the area of small farms, we do not tolerate small farms that run into economic problems. The small farmers go bankrupt, and we don't say we have a responsibility to bail them out. I mean, sometimes we do when there are very strange sorts of situations, but in the normal course of events, we say, well, they're businessmen and they're losing their businesses, and it's important that people who can't run a business are not able to manage a business, that they lose their businesses and they go on to something else. We
so
can't
this
keep
is a
supporting them, and
this
that's
is
what we say.
equivalent. This is equivalent to my bank. I become friends with the manager of the bank, the owner of the bank, and I keep messing up. I can't pay my loans, and I go to the bank, and they say, "No worries. Here's $1 million for your next 12 payments." And they can create a loan. Bank can create a loan out of thin air for $1 million for me. They could create a loan for $1 billion for me. But they are
Yeah, they didn't
propping
do it for
up
you, but
my
they
mis.
did it for Trump.
Well, but okay. So they keep propping up my mistakes. The manager at the bank who is propping up my mistakes. He is he is saying I will ignore your acting like a fool, and my doing this, I might be hurting like my employees. I might be actually screwing over my employees by doing this, by making horrible decisions. And but this bank manager keeps on giving me loans to cover myself. He is covering my malfeasance, my bad behavior. And that is exactly the same thing as what the Federal Reserve is doing. That they are covering up even more. Now it's $1 trillion a day of basically I mean, yes, we're in a crisis and something going wrong, but there is a very
Okay, so
significant
here's the
percentage
situation.
of, but there's a very significant
Right.
percentage of
Okay, so
misbehavior
here's
that
the
they're covering here.
situation. Okay, in the great financial crash of 2007 2008, okay, there was a lot of bad behavior. There was a lot, okay, of misjudgment. There were the CDOs and the CDSs and all those newfangled instruments,
Uh-huh.
okay, that were created to fool people into thinking there was some kind of safe and ingenious new things, okay, that were going on in financing,
And it
and that
also
were
allowed them to make the chain of title so difficult to understand that even there was nothing they could do.
exactly, okay, that led to the frauds, the mortgage frauds.
Oh yeah,
There,
the robo signing.
there was very, very, very bad behavior, which should have been punished with failure and prosecutions and things like that. But okay, Obama refused to do that. He worked to protect the bank people from the pitchforks. He protected their bonuses, okay, which they illicitly got. The whole thing was a swindle of the highest order,
Right,
and they got away with it, okay, and he got away with it. People
right.
still think, okay, that he was a great president. He was terrible. He wasn't. He was awful. Okay.
Yeah, well,
Uh,
yeah.
okay, but
He was a
now,
wonderful sounding horrible president.
okay, now it is 10 years later, okay, and they're still following some of the same practices. I'm sure there's a lot, okay, of bad behavior going on now. But this present crash that we are experiencing, of course, is not immediately due to them. It's immediately due to the coronavirus and the effects of the coronavirus and the fact that it's becoming necessary to shut down the economy and economic transactions. It's becoming necessary to get people off of work. They can't go to work. Okay, so this is not a result of the bad behavior of the banks, but far more than that, the problems we're having, okay, are a result of the bad behavior of the whole business community in shipping all the manufacturing capability overseas.
Right.
Okay, and
And the lack and the immense lack of preparation and
and the immense
anticipation.
lack, okay, of preparation because neoliberals, of course, do not plan for the future, or prepare for the future. Instead, what they do is they create these huge crises for people where they can then apply the shock doctrine and take
Right.
away everything people have.
Right. So
And
they create the problem and then they say, "Oh, there's a crisis and we need to deal with it, so we're going to take away even more. We're going to create an even bigger problem. Use
right,
that as an
which is
excuse."
what the Senate is involved in doing now. Okay, the Republican Senate. That's what happens when you vote for a Republican Senate. It wouldn't be quite as bad if there was a Democratic Senate right now. You'd still have a lot of the problem. Okay, a lot of the people, would just want to bail out the businesses, but they would be much more open to criticisms that you have to bail out the people too. Okay, but of
Right. They would
course,
they would yeah, they would still
uh,
screw us. They would just stroke our cheek while doing it.
well, it would be far better, okay, if it was a
It would
Democratic
be
Senate.
yeah,
Okay, in other
understood.
words, I think especially after what happened in 2008, there's a general understanding that if you're going to bail the banks out, you have to bail the people out too. That what was done in 2008, okay, in 2009 was extreme and shouldn't be happening again. There's an understanding of that on the Democratic side, I think. There is not an understanding of that with respect to those in power on the Republican side. Now, I think that there are some of the most right wing of the Republicans in the Senate who do surprisingly have an understanding of that because they're not so connected to big business as, say, Mitch McConnell is, or people like
And as
that.
we spoke about on Friday night with coronavirus, if they don't take care of us to some extent, that they will become infected, they will lose workers, they will lose customers.
Yes.
Um, okay. Uh, I feel like I feel like I'm much closer. So basically, this bailing out, this $1 trillion a day, is going to soon become infinite, or could become, approaching infinity, where it's just going to be untenable. Where we hear $100 trillion in a day, and it's like this is just on a, finally someone's going to say this is insane what's going on, and at
Well,
that point we're going to
if
have.
they keep on doing $1 trillion a day, before too long, it's going to seem untenable to people. I mean, after 2 weeks, and it's amounted to $14 trillion in QE, I think people across the board are going to be really fed up, and they're going to be starting to talk about taking the banks into resolution.
Okay. Is there some, I feel like I have now more pieces of understanding this, that this is much more interesting than I thought. I don't feel like it's all coming together. I feel like I could keep talking about this for quite a long time. Is there a sort of a generic, uh, like something to read or watch, or something to get a deeper understanding of this?
I'm not sure what kind of deeper understanding you are looking for.
I don't know what the questions
I
are.
think I think we've gotten to the core actually of the dynamic. But right now, I think that core is actually political. It has to do with when it becomes politically untenable for the Republicans to want to bail out the banks. Okay, above all, I think it'll become increasingly difficult for the people who are on the Democratic side, who are largely supportive of the banks, to keep on being supportive when it appears that it's just the federal government itself that is keeping the banks in business and that they are, in fact, insolvent. When that becomes apparent, there's going to be growing sentiment on the Democratic side for taking them into resolution and reorganizing the whole banking system. Now, how quickly that sentiment is going to develop on the Republican side, I don't know.
But the Democrats are just as bought by the banks as the Republicans are, or at least substantially so.
I don't think that every Democrat in the House, okay, is bought by the banks. Okay, there are a multiplicity, okay, of interests that support both representatives, okay, and also senators. I think people in the leadership of both parties in the House, okay, and in the Senate are largely bought by the banks. But of course, those people don't have to remain in leadership.
People meaning Dems.
Well, on the Democratic side, okay, or on the Republican side, I mean,
The leadership, Nancy Pelosi.
to some degree, they have to respond to the caucus. For example, take the TPA itself, in relation to the TPP. Okay, now Nancy Pelosi was staying neutral on that. Now, it was fairly obvious to me that she was not neutral, but 160 members of her caucus, were against the TPP. They were not bought by the financial people, okay, and but people who were favoring the trade policies of the United States. They opposed those trade policies because they saw the damage, okay, that was done. That was 160 out of the 188 Democrats in the Congress, okay, at that time. Okay, Nancy
Hmm.
Pelosi tried to stay neutral. Why would she stay neutral when there are obviously 28 of the Democrats who were with these trade agreements and 160 members of her caucus, 7/8 of her caucus, were opposed to the trades agreement?
I'm going to guess that she's staying passive to allow the donors so her staying passive allows the Republican majority to do whatever they want. So she can stay passive
She
without
was
overtly.
staying she was staying neutral so as to allow the 28 members of the caucus who wanted to go over to the other side to go over to the other side because she herself was a believer in the trade deals. She herself is a globalist. She
So
herself is a Petersonite. But she couldn't come out
so she's
in an
passively allowing
open
these things to
way.
happen. She's not explicitly allowing these things to happen.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
What she did is she stayed neutral until the end. And then she lined up with the rest of the caucus. But she allowed those people who wanted to go over to the Republican side to go over to the Republican side. She
yeah.
didn't have to. She could have exerted party discipline. Okay, at that point, it was worth 10 or 15 representatives anyway. And if those people had stayed with the Democrats, then the TPA would have been defeated in the House. It came close to being defeated anyway. Okay, so the
So she
point
speaks
is,
like she
her
cares, but she stays
caucus could
passive.
influence her. Her caucus could influence her. Okay, it influenced her to stay neutral and not to vote herself for those trade policies, though she probably favored them herself.
She
But
allowed people to
because
do it.
she stayed neutral and she gave the impression of being fair in that thing, she was more acceptable to them to stay as leader when they eventually took over the House again in 2000, okay, in 19.
Wow.
Okay,
Okay.
also something else, okay, that was important was that she staffed the leadership over the years so that there was no progressive alternative to her who could have run for the speakership.
Mm,
She was very careful about that. I mean, who did she have as her lieutenants? Okay, her top lieutenants. I mean, every one of them was an old person who, by themselves, didn't have a lot of influence. Okay, in the party. Uh, Actually, the one with the most influence was part of the leadership besides herself was Joe Crowley,
right.
and he was no spring chicken.
Right. Okay, we have one question, and I think this is a good thing to close on. My head is spinning. I'm like really starting to think about all this. I feel like this is very interesting. Like reserve, this is a reflection of a corrupt government propping up a corrupt system, and at
Yes.
some point, it's just not going to work anymore. These numbers are going to get so big that they can use their computer to do their magic and to not enforce their laws or all these human created concepts. And at some point, people are going to just the real world consequences are going to start appearing, feeling much bigger than they're propping up. I mean, that's not the
Yeah, I
greatest way of
mean,
saying it, but you
it's
know what
going
I
to
mean.
be people deciding they're doing such a bad job, okay, of running things. Why don't we just get rid of them?
Right. Okay. Very interesting. Now
It's
I
going to be
like.
this feeling.
Yeah. Okay. We have one question I think would be a good thing to close on. And now I'm just okay. Um, Andrew has a comment. What happens when a bank goes bankrupt or is taken into resolution?
Okay, what happens is that And the best person to read about that, okay, is actually Bill Black. He's the one who knows the most about that because he's taken banks into resolution.
Hmm.
Okay, but basically what happens is the bank closes on Friday night. The resolvers go into the bank on Friday night. They take over the management of the bank. They take over control of the books. They take over control of the funds. They take over everything. Okay. The bank opens up again on Monday morning in federal hands.
Okay.
And then the government essentially manages the the actual recovery process of the bank. Okay, the injection, okay, of funds, the protection of the depositors, okay, is all run by the federal government, okay, itself, okay,
And
and there are various things, okay, which the resolvers can do. The main thing that seems to be in the offing for now is to hold the bank until they've placed it on a sound basis again. And then, okay, this is a big question. Should we turn it over to private capital again? And when they turn it over to private capital again, then the private capital has to pay for it. Okay, they have to buy the bank essentially back. Okay, so that it goes into but private hands. It's not simply a gift which the federal government gives to private people. Okay, they have to pay for it. Now, there's also, okay, an option. Okay, I don't actually know the law well enough, okay, to know this, but there's certainly a policy option where Congress can decide to give the federal government the option to keep on owning those banks that have failed and to keep on operating them and have federal civil servants actually operating these banks. Okay, that if that's not an option now, that can be made an option by the Congress.
I have a question. So if the
Yes.
federal government takes over these banks in particularly in this administration, how do we have any faith that those federal officials are any less corrupt than the bankers they're taking over?
Well, the federal civil servants, and there's no one in the banks who can bribe them, okay, because they have control, okay, of all the funds in the banks. Usually, federal civil servants,
What
people
is
who've
this?
been, in the
I don't
federal
know the.
government, okay, for their whole lives, okay, and who are part of this enforcement mechanism involving actually taking banks into resolutions, are career people. They have a rule book. They have guides and standards, okay, to follow. They're people who are dedicated, and generally speaking, they're not very corrupt. They're very tough. And those people still exist in the federal government today.
But the people who decide who these people will be that will take over this bank, why would they choose to have these not corrupt people take over these banks that they're friendly with?
Well,
I mean, maybe this,
it's
maybe I'm getting
part of the
naive.
federal civil service that has actually developed over a period, okay, of years, and those are the people who are there. So they don't get to choose who's going to take it over. It's the institution that actually does the resolution. Okay, I forget. I'm not sure if it's the FDIC that actually does this. Okay, or what the name of the institution? Oh, well, Sandy Degg says, okay, it's the FDIC. Okay, so they take it over, and that's staffed actually mainly by civil servants who are fairly well paid and highly skilled, and they do a good, okay, an honest job with banks that fail.
Okay, so I'm just going to push this one step farther, and then I'm going to let this go. The Congress can do whatever it wants. It can change the law. The executive branch has a lot of power as well. They can do a lot of things.
Yeah.
So, devil's advocate here, don't they have the power to have a little more power than? I mean, I just feel like the unending corruption of our government would do whatever they could to prop up their big donors, some of whom are at these banks. So you're saying that they only have a limited choice, and you really, I mean, I guess that you believe that these federal servants, that like Congress is going to decide that these not corrupt people are going to go into these banks and basically take these banks down, which is seems just
Well,
against their nature of being bought off in this way.
okay, so the Dodd-Frank bill is there. It is current law. There are rules for taking over these banks, okay, that are insolvent. Whether they're going to be taken over or not, okay, those are decisions that are made at the FDIC level. If the resolvers start going into the insolvent banks, okay, and start to take them over, that's not something in the hands of the Congress unless
They
the
pass a whole
Congress
new.
decides to pass a law. Then they've got to go through that whole process, and they have to get by the Democrats, okay, in the House, and many of the Republicans also, who are going to
And
be supporting that process because they won't
okay,
have sympathy for these failed banks.
and the public will be much more aware of this situation. And if they try and pass a law that gets allows corrupt people to go in, and then that would be much more a publicly seen thing. And it, if they're angry enough for wanting these banks to go into receivership, if that's the term, then they're going to be also aware enough to see them doing an effort to try and screw up this process. So that's the answer.
Yes, I think that the proper term is the banks are brought into a resolution situation.
Resolution. Okay.
Okay,
Okay.
if they go into bankruptcy and they go before, okay, a bankruptcy judge, then they go into receivership.
Okay. Okay.
Okay,
Thank
but
you
if
for
they go
correcting.
into resolution first, okay, because they're taken over by the federal government, then that option is no longer there.
Okay. Would the banks do anything if they knew that this was an inevitability? Would they claim bankruptcy, for example?
They might try to claim bankruptcy before the resolvers can come in. I suppose, yeah, that's a possibility. But if the federal government wants to keep them open because they think the banks are systemically dangerous or systemically important, then
Oh,
I think the option is open for the FDIC to keep them open.
interesting. Too big to fail. Okay. All right, Joe. My head is spinning. This has become all of a sudden, for the first time, a very interesting topic where it has just been this idea of interest rates, of overnight interest rates for the Federal Reserve, has always seemed out of touch for me. Has always seemed distant and not relevant. And now all of a
Okay,
sudden,
but
it feels very relevant.
the person among the MMTers who knows most about this aspect of things is certainly Bill Black.
If it
He
goes
knows
into
everything about it.
about even the interest rate part of it, or after they go into, I forget the term, the resolution,
He
at
knows
that point, or
all
he
about
also
he
knows
knows
about the
all
interest rate part
about
of it, the past hour,
the resolution process.
the
He
resolution, the
knows about
resolution.
the fine details of the resolution
Okay, all right,
process.
that
Whatever I know, a little I know, okay, about the resolution process, that comes from Bill's writing.
great.
Okay,
Okay,
my
that's interesting.
understanding, okay, of Bill's writing. So he's
I
the
am
guy
interested.
to go to on this.
Wonderful. All right, so that is secondary. I want to know about that, but first I want to flesh out this interest rate stuff because now it's all of a sudden becoming a really, really interesting thing for me. And now I just want to keep talking about it. But I think this is a good place to stop. We've been going for we've been going for a good amount at this
Close
point.
to 2.5 hours now.
Yeah, I don't want to go to our 3 hour record again. Not tonight. But actually, I would actually I have other things I would love to talk about you with you. If maybe we could do this again. I've really enjoyed talking with you on Friday and tonight.
Okay, maybe next week or the week after, something like that, because I want to go back to talking about the current crisis that we're going through right now. There are some very,
Sure,
very significant things to talk about there. And so
sure.
I'm going to want to
So
do
maybe two
that over
weeks.
the next few days. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe perhaps 2 weeks from now we'll talk offline. But you've been incredibly helpful. You all of a sudden meaningful. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I
Good.
can think of at least three others that I would love to dive into as well.
Okay, well, but thank you very much for the interview. I really enjoyed it. Okay, I enjoyed our two conversations, okay, at this point, and we can certainly get back to more conversations within a couple of weeks or so.
That would be wonderful. Okay, thank you very much, Joe. I look forward to your more coronavirus related stuff as we go forward. So
Okay, well, I
enjoy
think
your night.
I'll be talking about the economic or the MMT aspects of that. Okay, I
Right, of
think
dealing
more
with it.
than
Of
just
dealing with it.
the yeah, pure coronavirus. There, but some very important things have come out from Stephanie Kelton and from Rohan Gray.
Right, the trillion
Okay,
dollar coin.
and yeah, and of course we have now the first bill in Congress, an actual bill that proposes using the $1 trillion coin
Two
for
of
a
them.
particular purpose. Two of them, yes. Okay. It is the Rashida Tlaib bill, and uh, it's a really great bill.
Yeah, I
Okay,
only know I barely even know the basics of it, but I look forward to learning more about that.
yeah, yeah.
Evelina in the
I'll be
comments
going into
says,
that tomorrow night.
okay, great. Evelina says, does sound like a catch-22, doesn't it? I don't know what you're referring to, Evelina. I am curious, but you can write that in the comments. Joe, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your night, and
I will.
we'll talk offline, and we'll talk again. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks, Jeff.
Good night. Good
Good
night,
night.
everybody. Thank you.
Okay, folks. So I'm here alone now. Uh, I would love to consider your comments, but it's very late for me too. So I think, okay, I'm going to say goodnight. But I see you have some very interesting comments on the way the lobby was at the bank today. We have to get, okay, a little bit of cash out of the bank too, and I'm wondering what we'll see. But we only expect to, be in the car and go up to the drive-up window. Uh, so anyway, thank you all for coming, and thank you all for staying, and thank you all for whatever sharing that you've been able to do. Uh, I'll be seeing you tomorrow, okay, at 9 o'clock, and I will be talking about some of the latest things that have come from MMT land in relation to coping with the coronavirus, with the economic aspects, okay, of the coronavirus, and what we have to do to keep the country open. And these, of course, are very, very important topics. By the way, I think overt congressional financing may also be about to come out of the closet, and I'll be talking about that tomorrow night as well. So good night, and I'll see you tomorrow.